Are you guys ready to kick some fucking ass? Fuck yeah!
Born in the shadows of giants like Metallica and Slayer, they emerged not as followers, but as the technical evolution of a genre. Legends of the San Francisco Bay Area, they would become pioneers of the second wave of thrash. Despite an incredibly aggressive sound, some of their music actually had roots in jazz. Even instrumental jazz-funk fusion guitarist Joe Satriani would help to shape the band's sound early on. Singer Chuck Billy would also channel his Native American heritage, a voice that would become one of the most commanding in heavy metal history. This is Souls of Black, the story of Testament.
Right then, the crowd just went off, and a riot squad showed up, and 60 police officers, the whole force came down, and they escorted us right out of town.
The San Francisco Bay Area is a term that has become synonymous with thrash metal. Metallica, although formed in LA, are one of the most iconic names associated with this scene.
We got some maniacs here tonight.
Exodus, Death Angel, and Possessed all have strong links here. And as we all know, in terms of thrash, the biggest names are Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax, who became known as the Big Four. Although this was great for thrash metal as a genre, it meant that many other groups were often overlooked, Testament included.
How does it make you feel when someone compares your music to Metallica?
Now, in Los Angeles, we had what would come to be known as hairspray, or rather hair metal, that focused on over-the-top theatrics, glam hair, ridiculous clothing, and I guess what you could call cheesy aesthetics. Motley Crue, Poison, Rat, and others would essentially fall into this category. This was more of the glam metal scene, and thrash was essentially a rejection of this. Thrash metal was about raw, unfiltered, and aggressive music. Tape trading was at its peak, and metal fanzines such as Metal Mania were the go-to resources for discovering the latest thrash music. Whilst Motley Crue and Kiss were firing off pyrotechnics, the thrash scene was playing in small, sweaty, and chaotic venues where the mosh pit was master. The first time I ever heard the term thrash, Kerry called me on the phone and said, "Hey, I'm putting this band together, guitar player and drummer. I want you to play bass and you sing too." And then he mentioned the name Iron Maiden, and I'm thinking, who's that? So I went out and bought the record, and when I'm listening to it, I was like, oh my god. The Metal Blade guy came to us and said, if we do a single, he'll put it on a compilation album. We heard it and thought, well shit, we can put out something heavier and faster than that. That compilation album was called Metal Massacre and would be released on Metal Blade Records in 1982, which was subsequently the first record ever released on the label, a label that would become known as the home of thrash music for much of the 80s. The record featured several unsigned bands such as Steeler, Bitch, Malice, Metallica's Hit the Lights, and even weirdly Rat. Yep, that Rat. This compilation itself was not strictly a thrash compilation. I mean, thrash wasn't really an actual genre yet. If we look at the year 1982, we only have a couple of records that are actually labeled as thrash. We have Metallica's demo tape, No Life Till Leather, and Venom's Black Metal, which, yes, is labeled black metal as well. But we also had Witching Metal by Sodom, again, another demo cassette. I think it's safe to say that 1983 was the true birth of thrash metal. We of course had Kill 'Em All by Metallica and Slayer's Show No Mercy, not to mention Soldiers of Metal by Anthrax and Hellhammer's Triumph of Death amongst a few other releases. It's worth noting as well that we had Power in Black, an early demo from Overkill. Also an album that almost never gets mentioned is One Nation Underground by Hawaii, featuring Marty Friedman. I do digress a little bit though. The point is, 1983 would be the birth of true thrash metal music from a commercial release perspective. And also, the same year, Testament would form. Testament would form in Berkeley, California, originally called Legacy.
In the 80s when I was in Legacy, there was a couple of guys from Legacy and Violence, and we had jobs at this Subaru place.
They started out with a different lineup and went through a couple of variations during this time period before assembling what we now know as their classic lineup of Chuck, Alex, Eric, Greg, and Louis. The original vocalist for Testament would be Steve Souza, who went on to join Exodus around 1986. Testament sounded different from 1985 on. We started our career trying to be playing thrash metal, but always trying to put a melodic twist in it, or always trying to put a hook into it. I think in our earlier years we've developed that, and I think it's stuck with us, especially me as a vocalist, trying to keep it heavy but keep some melody and hook in it. Chuck, like many rebellious metal kids, would be raised as a Catholic, one of the most common catalysts for the development of heavy metal in general. Born in 1962 to a Native American father and Mexican mother. My father is Native American and my mum is Mexican, and she also has some Native American blood in her. My father was raised on the Hopeland Indian Reservation, which is about 2 hours north of San Francisco. I was born in Oakland. There was just so much freedom on the reservation. I hate to say it, but there were just a bunch of wild Indians. It was crazy back then. Our tribe and reservation is really small, and before we ever had a casino on the land, there wasn't a lot of hope. There wasn't any money around, and it just felt desperate. It was dire, especially with education and basic resources. The kids didn't even have the basic stuff other kids had in the rest of the country. So a lot of kids didn't even bother going to school. One thing I want to touch on here is that the reservation Chuck is referring to did indeed have a casino on it, and he claims that it actually saved the reservation. There is a rather stereotypical perception that Native Americans spent a lot of time running casinos and drinking, and well, according to Chuck, that's not too far from the truth. There's always the stereotypical stuff about Indians being drunk and high on the reservation and all of that stuff. And yes, there was a lot of that back then, but you can say that about a lot of other places in the world. If you have a situation as rough as it was for our tribe back then, you're going to have people escaping into alcohol and drug abuse. It was tough in the beginning because there were people running the casino that had no idea what they were doing. So there was some corruption and mismanagement of funds, but they eventually got the right people in there and it's flourishing now. The casino changed everything for the better. So it would seem that despite being of Native American heritage, he faced the same problems as basically every other teenager in America to a certain extent, and many parts of the world. So once again, heavy metal became a positive path for a young kid to follow. Before Chuck found Testament though, the group had already released a demo under Legacy in 1985. And honestly, it sounds pretty epic. The demo would be produced by Doug Piercy, who went on to produce Heathen's debut album, Breaking the Silence, in 1987. He was actually in Heathen. With Testament being formed by guitarist Eric Peterson, the influences would be pretty similar to most metal bands from this era. His main figureheads when it came to guitar though would be Michael Scheckner, Leon Roth, and Ace Frehley of Kiss. My main ones would be Michael Scheckner and of course Leon Roth. I'm talking all old stuff too. You know, records I grew up listening to in high school, like Entranced and Tokyo Tapes, and Frank Marino. He's one of my all-time favorite players. That style, that's kind of the ballpark where I'm at. early Kiss stuff with Ace Frehley, the bluesy stuff he did. A lot of his leads were not that long, but they say so much in those 10 seconds. His solos have great hooks and are so memorable. I'd say some great records to check out here would be Force It by UFO, Taken by Force and Blackout by Scorpions, and Frehley's Comet by Ace Frehley. So once again, Testament is another great example of a heavier and more aggressive metal group that was heavily influenced by more blues-based hard rock.
Shoot it for you gotta stand so now, dance your life away. How do you feel tonight? Get up. Yeah, you're in love with my sister. Well, it's alive. With me to take off. I really had to take off. Off control. Nothing that you can. The more love you give, the more you find. When I say I'll stay with you, right through that danger zone. In the night, when the sun don't bite.
And I'm absolutely biased here because Scorpions are one of my favorite groups, and I just happen to own Frehley's Comet as well, another favorite album of mine. And if you listen to the 1985 demo by Legacy, you can absolutely hear some of these influences from a guitarist point of view. So the foundations were there, and as thrash broke through into the mainstream, Testament would take their rightful place within this chaotic movement of metal and partner up with one of the most iconic thrash labels of the era.
It's more of just about things that we've gone through in our lives, you know, just growing up and just things that are involved in this certain age.
What do Metallica, Merciful Fate, and Manowar have in common? In 1983, they were all signed to the same label and released records via Megaforce Records. Megaforce Records would be formed by John Zazula in 1982 and famously helped Metallica to release their debut album, Kill 'Em All. Over the next several years, Megaforce would help to launch the careers of Anthrax, Overkill, and Testament. Metallica's Kill 'Em All would be released via Megaforce in 1983, along with Melissa by Merciful Fate, and the debut by Anthrax, Fistful of Metal, in 1984. Also another great record from this label in 1984 is Heavy Metal Breakdown by Gravedigger. Testament's debut record would be called The Legacy and would hit the shelves in 1987 and would be somewhat influenced by Joe Satriani. Testament had brought in 18-year-old Alex Skolnick on guitar to join the group for their first record, and he was taught by Satriani. In 1986, Satriani released his debut album, Not of This Earth, and his second studio album, Surfing with the Alien, released the following year, even brought him some Billboard chart success early on in the US. And this was not thrash music. It was instrumental rock and synth mixed over jazz and funk. Not exactly the influence you'd expect to connect with Testament. However, just listen to the solo on the opening song from The Legacy, Over the Wall, and you'll hear it hit. This melodic and technical style of solo helped Testament to stand out from the rest of the thrash scene. In 1987, thrash bands in general were not delivering this type of epic melodic guitar solo with such technical precision, or even at all. I was very young. I was 14, 15 while I was studying with him, and a lot of the things were over my head, but he definitely gave me a roadmap. I try not to overdo it. I don't want to sound like somebody who listens to too much Alan Holdsworth playing over a metal song. I want it to sound metal, but also would like to tastefully be able to throw in some lines that maybe come from John Coltrane or Wes Montgomery. I think my playing overall is more locked in, because to play jazz improvisation well, it's about rhythm as much as it is about harmony, and getting the rhythm together really develops your listening skills and your mental skills too. Coltrane was an American saxophonist, and Wes Montgomery was an American jazz guitarist. They were both mainly active around the late 40s and 50s. They definitely were not part of the thrash scene. And whilst Coltrane was a saxophone aficionado, as a guitar player myself, I can absolutely see how this could transfer to guitar. So whilst the Legacy would be a technically precise thrash masterpiece, it actually held some roots in instrumental jazz. Of course, by 1987, Slayer had already churned out Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, and Rain in Blood. Metallica had Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Megadeth had released Killing Is My Business and Peace Sells. And Anthrax and Overkill had also put out some great thrash records by this time. So by the time the Legacy had seen the light of day, these other groups were kind of already dominating this genre. I kind of feel that this record doesn't get enough credit for its technical ability whilst being in the genre of thrash, and I think it's because it was heavily overlooked due to the already existing dominance of other records I just mentioned. And even guitarist Alex touched on this in an interview many years later. I think my first gig was early 86, so 1986, what happened that year? Metallica releases Master of Puppets. They were already on their third record, they were on their way to becoming one of the biggest bands in the world, which was clear. I mean, it wasn't clear they would be that level, but we knew they were going to be at least as big as Iron Maiden and Scorpions at that time. So they were already off and running. Slayer released Rain in Blood that year after having several albums out. Anthrax had several records out. I think at that point Megadeth was on their second record. So all those bands, they were past their first record. They were all off and running. At the time, the classic Testament lineup was just forming. This even led some people to retrospectively state that the Big Four should have been the Big Five. Although Alex even stated himself that only one band from this era really broke free from the chains of thrash. And also during the recording process for this record, some of the band joked about the studio being haunted, or at least hinted that it was very eerie and somewhat creepy, which some say helped to shape the sound of the record. The Legacy would be recorded at Pyramid Sound in New York. This is the same studio where Anthrax recorded Fistful of Metal, Overkill laid down Feel the Fire, and Stormtroopers of Death smashed out Speak English or Die. In terms of the album's legacy, I guess we could even look at an album like The Legacy and see it as a second wave of thrash. Metallica found a way to make their music very popular, but they really kind of broke loose from the scene that they came up in. And it's brilliant what they did, but they're really the only ones that could achieve any mainstream popularity. Although groups like Metallica would even leave thrash behind and go fully commercial in the 90s. Although that future hadn't quite been written yet, we're still in the late 80s, and before this decade was over, Testament would release two more incredible records: The New Order in 1988 and Practice What You Preach in 1989. Both of these albums not only saw the development of this second wave of thrash sound that Testament brought to the genre, but both records landed the band Billboard chart positions. Again, both released on Megaforce Records, and of course, they also had support from the one and only Headbangers Ball.
But we couldn't. But we did get the guys from Testament here. We've got Chuck Billy and Louis Clementi. How you guys doing?
Good, pretty good. Right.
Welcome to the ball.
And as we all know, if you found yourself on Headbangers Ball, you were doing something right. The New Order album was another thrash masterpiece, and even featured a cover of Aerosmith's Nobody's Fault, a song taken from Aerosmith's fourth studio album, Rocks, way back in 1976. once again helping to highlight the important influence of 70s hard rock within Testament. Headbangers Ball even featured Testament's music video for Nobody's Fault. And we also have 2 instrumental songs on New Order, along with 1 on Practice What You Preach, helping to possibly solidify the influence of Joe Satriani. Although not surprisingly, Skolnick also cited Van Halen and Jeff Beck as an influence as well, amongst many others of course. Testament had helped to redefine the sound of thrash during the late 80s and even started to see some commercial success. Practice What You Preach would officially be the group's commercial breakthrough. The record landed at 77 on the Billboard charts, and singles taken from this LP, Practice What You Preach, The Ballad, and Greenhouse Effect, would rack up some impressive figures across radio stations, and that ever vital support from MTV's Headbangers Ball helped to push them to the next level. It's kind of neat to see yourself on TV, but aside from that, I don't really like it. There are some great videos out there, but it costs a lot of money to put out a really good video. And I don't think I could really enjoy videos unless I could really do everything that I wanted to do in a video and make some kind of statement, but it just doesn't work that way. If you're going to get played on MTV, you have to conform, and I usually don't like conforming, but it's part of the game. And in comparison to, say, And Justice for All by Metallica, released in 1988, just 1 year prior, that record peaked at number 6 on the Billboard chart, which might seem like a huge gap from number 77, which it is, but the fact remains. Testament were also charting at the same time as Metallica with an epic thrash-orientated album during this era. And whilst the 1990s would see their biggest records of the era, the classic lineup was about to become severely fractured. "1990, quite frankly, an incredible year for thrash and metal music overall.
All right, Italy.
We had Rust in Peace by Megadeth, Seasons in the Abyss by Slayer, Coma of Souls by Creator, and Cowboys from Hell by Pantera. So what could Testament have to offer at the start of this new decade? Well, they would release their 4th studio album, Souls of Black. And for many fans, this is the ultimate Testament record. The title track itself, Souls of Black, over the years has become one of the most iconic Testament songs. And this record would push slightly higher in the charts.
Now, you guys actually just got back in America. You were in Europe with the Clash of the Titans show, right?
This album even helped to secure the band a place on one of the greatest thrash tours of all time, Clash of the Titans. Clash of the Titans' main headliners would be Megadeth and Slayer, so not bad company to be with. However, because the band were due to be on this tour, Megaforce Records had to pressure the band to get a new album ready to promote, and that album would become Souls of Black. And I guess a weird fact about one song from this album, in terms of inspiration, would be 7 Days of May. This particular song actually references the protests that took place in Tiananmen Square in China in 1989, an incident the Chinese government actually tried to deny ever happened. This incident spawned one of the most well-known photographs depicting a protest in modern history. But I'm not sure how many metalheads would have known this at the time, or even cared. Let's be honest, thrash was never really about healing the world, it was about cracking a six-pack and headbanging in a mosh pit. Regardless, Souls of Black would become one of the most iconic thrash records to come from this era. But it was also kind of the beginning of the end for this classic lineup and Testament, well, at least from a commercial standpoint. In 1992, Testament would release their highest charting album of this era, The Ritual. Released in May of that year, it reached number 55 in the Billboard charts. However, it had some serious competition, and not just from the thrash genre. The early 90s was essentially the death of this era of thrash. The rise of grunge had taken over, and cardigan-loving, heroin-chic hipsters were dominating the airwaves. Metallica had managed to transition their sound to a more radio pop-friendly aesthetic with the Black Album, but bands like Testament would essentially be left by the wayside. There are loads of reasons why we failed. I could spend hours going through all the mistakes we made and were made on our behalf. We all truly felt we could have been very big, but then grunge came along, and neither MTV nor radio wanted to know about the sort of music we did. We had a battle to get any sort of exposure. So even MTV had turned its back on thrash. Headbangers Ball was out, and soft-strumming, candle-lit MTV Unplugged was in. And of course we had the general shift in metal as well, with the likes of Pantera taking over your town. And I think the final nail in the coffin for Testament would come with the departure of basically half the classic lineup. After the release of The Ritual, Alex and drummer Louis would part ways with the band, which removed a key sound element from Testament's music. I think Alex just wanted to get away from playing metal. He was so young when he joined the band, and now wanted to do other, more jazzy stuff, and this didn't fit in Testament. We never fell out with him, it was only a musical thing, we always kept in touch. It seemed Alex kind of got bored of being the metal guy or just being engulfed in metal music. His roots, after all, were more reflective of his love for jazz. I think overall, he wanted to experience a broader spectrum of music, and went on to record A Handful of Rain by Savatage, released in 1994. While still heavy metal, it definitely gave him the opportunity to explore a more progressive sound from a technical point of view as a musician. But I can't help but wonder if Testament would have helped to stave off the attack from grunge if they had also followed a more diverse musical direction after The Ritual. I had no experience leading a band. I don't think I was ready at the time. I was sort of able to bring song ideas to Testament and work with them, but it was still a band that already existed before I was there. I think in retrospect, I would have been better off playing in more bands that were started by somebody else, but I didn't want that at the time because the Testament experience was very overwhelming. Testament, with a new lineup, continued their thrash metal onslaught with their 6th studio album Low, which ironically charted extremely low compared to their commercial breakthrough albums. The sound was completely different. Whilst the record itself is officially labeled as thrash, it also has elements of groove metal and, dare I say it, a slight industrial metal vibe in parts. And to kind of back up this point, if you have a listen to Soul of a New Machine by Fear Factory, released in 1992, 2 years before Low, well, tell me there aren't some serious similarities here. Soul of a New Machine would be labeled as death metal and industrial metal. Maybe this was a direction Testament wanted to try and follow. A very cool cover song from this era of Testament for the music nerds. They released a single from this album called Dog-Faced Gods in 1994, and the B-side actually featured a cover of Scorpion's Sails of Charon, taken from their 1977 album Taken by Force. A song that features one of the most epic intro solos of all time. I might get destroyed in the comments for saying this, but seriously, forget Eddie Van Halen's Eruption and go and check out what Uli Jon Roth does on this song. Despite this super cool cover, this was essentially the end of the classic Testament era, and the end of their commercial prowess from this time period. And they kind of just sailed off into the thrash abyss. And whether it was really grunge that finished them off, or the departure of Alex Skolnick, we'll never really know. What we do know is that the 5 records they did release between 1987 and 1992 are unquestionably 5 of the most iconic and underrated thrash albums of the era. They of course have released many more records since and have also reunited with Alex. And they even started to see chart success again from 2008 on a regular basis. So when we look back at the history of thrash and consider the big four, is number 5 actually missing?